Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Walsh, and I'm from Grace Church in Hale Wood, and I was looking forward to being with you this morning in person there at Oral Park. But obviously that's not been possible, so we're doing the next best thing and providing a video talk this morning, which I hope you will find helpful. Can I just bring you the love of the folk over at Grace? We are praying for you and for all of the churches in the city at this time, and it's difficult, isn't it? It's strange, and there's a lot to deal with at the moment, but I don't know about you, but we're finding it just such a great encouragement that at the very least we're able to connect through technology. Even though we're remote at the moment, we can still be together as a body through video and other technology. So let's use that this morning to spend some time in God's Word. And if you have a Bible, please could you turn up the Gospel of John and turn to John chapter 21. John chapter 21. And we're going to spend some time in the first 14 verses. So John 21, last chapter of John, and verses 1 to 14. And the talk this morning I've given the title, A Living Parable. A Living Parable. And I'll explain in a moment or two perhaps why I've chosen that title for these first 14 verses. Before we get into them, I wonder whether you recognise this man. Look at this high-tech solution that I have here. Look at that. Wow, seamlessly. Peter Falk as Lieutenant Columbo. For those of you of a certain age, my age certainly, and maybe a little bit older, I don't know, and a bit younger, you will remember him. He was on the TV a lot in the 1970s and right through into the 1980s. One of the famous TV detectives. And what made Columbo as a series unique was that whereas all the other series, the other crime shows, you had to guess who did the crime. In the case of Columbo, you knew at the beginning who did the crime because the crime was on the screen. You saw it happen. And what was exciting about the next hour was that you were able to follow Columbo as he solved the case. So you knew what the ending was. What was exciting was how they got to it. And his very famous catchphrase, you'll know it, was just one more thing. And he'd utter those famous words when he'd been interrogating, or maybe not interrogating somebody, but he'd been asking them a bunch of questions, and he'd finished asking the questions and he was saying goodbye, he was leaving the room, he was on his way out the door was just closing, and just before Columbo disappeared, he'd pop his head back round and say, just one more thing. And it wasn't an afterthought, it wasn't something he'd suddenly thought of. It was there all the time. This was the key question he was going to ask, and it would actually start to unlock the case. And you'd have the dramatic music because this was a key moment in the action. Well, here in John chapter 21, it strikes me as a little bit like John, the writer. This is his one more thing, because if you look at the end of chapter 20, verse 30 even of the last chapter, chapter 20, it reads as if that's the end. It's all done, it's all wrapped up, it's great, it's finished. And then 21 is the one more thing moment. It's the PS, it's the encore. And, like Columbo, it's not an afterthought, it's critical. It really is key to the gospel, and it's an amazing chapter because it connects what's gone before throughout John into what is coming next as we progress into the book of Acts. So that's perhaps a little bit of context for you. But why call these 14 verses, a living parable. Well, you may well be familiar with parables. These were stories that Jesus told, fictitious stories, but he used them to illustrate two things. And they were commonplace stories. They were involving situations and people who would have been very familiar. But they illustrated key truths about two things. The first thing is who Jesus was, who Jesus is. And secondly, what he is doing, what his kingdom is all about. That's the two essential elements in a parable. And what we have here in the first 14 verses of John 21, as we go through them, is a story. It's a living story. It's a living parable that will teach who Jesus is and what he is doing. And the disciples who are part of this story will find themselves as key players in this living parable. I want you to actually follow this with me as a story. That's the strength. Well, not strength, but that's how I get my head around these 14 verses, by reading them as a story, following it as it goes, putting the pieces together and letting it build like a story, like a parable. Okay, so should we jump into the action then? And in verse 1 of John 21, you'll notice actually John, the author, gives you a little author's note. And he says, after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples on the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. And John wants you to focus not just on the fact that Jesus will appear to the disciples, but the way it happens. That's key. Okay? So, a living parable, and I'd like us to just home in on the first three verses, first of all, because what we see here is what I've called a familiar failure in the first three verses. And it starts off with the disciples on the beach, and the scene is quite a flat one, really. The impression you get is that they're not sure what to do. They're by their boats, they're by their nets, they're on the beach, they're in a familiar setting, a familiar place. And it could well feel flat, couldn't it? Because the last 3 years have been such a roller coaster ride with Jesus, and now it seems to be over. And it's just totally unclear what the next step really is. Well, the camera focuses on Simon Peter. And what do we know about Peter? We know a few things about Peter, perhaps two things we know about Peter. Firstly, he struggles to keep his mouth shut. He always has to be the first to speak. He also has to be the man of action. He has to just be doing something. He finds it hard to rest, and that's the case here. So he suddenly declares, and you see it in these first three verses here, I'm going fishing. I can't be sitting here doing nothing. It's time to get back to some reality. It's time to get back to something that I know, something I can touch, I can relate to. So I'm going to do what I've always done. I'm going to go fishing. And he convinces the others to join him. And we've seen throughout John and the other gospel accounts that Peter is something of a natural leader. He has influence. He may not always get it right, but people do listen to him and they follow him, and they follow him now. And they get into the boat. And they go out at night, the best time to fish. And they work the Sea of Tiberias all night. And there in verse 3, we read that they catch absolutely nothing. Now, there is no good reason, no good natural reason why this should have been such a disastrous fishing trip, because they've chosen the right time of day, or rather night, to go. And there's no reason why they shouldn't have caught at least one fish, but absolutely nothing. No fish have been caught. Well, no good reason here in John chapter 21. There was no good reason if you were to turn over to another gospel, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, where you would read again of the disciples as fishermen, going out, capturing absolutely no fish at all. They spent a night fishing and they caught nothing. It's just history repeating itself. Can you just keep that connection in your mind? Luke 5, the first time this failure happened. That's why I've called it familiar, because it's happened again. There's been no fish caught, and I'm sure they had feelings of deja vu. So after a disappointing night at sea, they make their way back to shore. So there we have it. For now, it's a failure, and it's a familiar one. Let's just move forward into verse 4, where a familiar failure will actually give way to a familiar miracle. And the night gives way to morning, and as they approach the shore, they see a figure waiting for them. But you notice something strange in the text, in the story here. It's Jesus standing on the shore. We're told that quite clearly. Verse 4, Jesus is standing on the shore. And he's going to speak to them in a moment, so he must be reasonably close and visible. But they don't recognize him. He's not made any attempt to disguise his appearance from what we read. Jesus hasn't changed visually. But he doesn't allow himself to be recognized straight away. There is a reason for this, which I think unfolds as the story unfolds. But for now, can I just remind you, and you can look back in chapter 20 and verse 11, you'll read about Jesus visually appearing to Mary Magdalene at the tomb. And she didn't recognize him by sight either. And when he appeared to Mary there in chapter 20, he asked her two questions that he knew the answer to, but he asked her two questions. And he will do exactly the same now. He will ask these disciples a question to which he knows the answer. Why? Well, can I suggest that Jesus, although he knows everything, he knows the answer to everything, and he knows the answer to what's in our hearts, still wants and needs for us to answer and to express our need. In the case of Mary, he wanted her to express her need. He asked her, "Who are you looking for, and why are you weeping?" He knew why, and he knew who, but he needed Mary to express her need. Here, in an equivalent way, he will ask the disciples to express their need as well. And the question is a simple one. Have you caught any fish? Well, they're tough, experienced, hardened, proud fishermen. Not the kind of question you would really want to ask them after they've had a disappointing night at sea. But their response as we read it, they don't make excuses, they don't try and cover it up. They just simply answer no. Honest answer. To Jesus' question, have you any fish? The answer is no. And so Jesus, still unrecognized at this point, gives them an instruction. And it's the same one, pretty much, that he gave them back in Luke chapter 5. Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And you notice that word find is really important. What Jesus doesn't say is put the net back out, set back out into the sea, give it a couple of hours and see what happens. No. They are near the shore. They're not in the deep waters anymore. They're in the shallows. Worst place for fish. But he just says, cast your net right now on the right side and you will find them. In other words, the fish are there waiting to be caught. So, is it any surprise at all as we move into verse 6 and they obey Jesus that what happens next is what happens next. In fact, what else could happen next when Jesus tells them to cast the net? We read that the quantity of fish, the quantity is so big that they can't even haul it into the boat. And at this point, the penny drops for John, the disciple John. Or what's really happening is, at this point, Jesus has opened John's eyes to who he is, who has given the command and who has given the promise. Drop the net and you will find some. And he declares to Peter, it is the Lord. He's appeared once again. Just let's pause for a moment and just think about the amazing journey that he's taken them on in just a few moments, really. Because as they returned to shore after the night of failure, the familiar failure, he could have opened their eyes straight away, and as soon as they approached the shore, they could have seen, it's Jesus, it is the Lord. They know what he looks like. He's not changed. But no, he doesn't reveal himself at that point. He held back. He could have opened their eyes when he first spoke to them. His voice could have been instantly recognisable. The voice hasn't changed, but no, he held back. And he could have opened their eyes by giving them this miraculous catch. But even then, he held back. Why? Because before he gave them the miracle, he needed them to express their need. To express the need of him. And actually in so doing acknowledge that without Jesus, it's kind of a familiar failure. And this is why I think of this as a living parable, because they're learning a truth now. That he asks them what is their need, and then he supplies it. And isn't that the pattern throughout the gospel accounts of Jesus asking people obvious questions? I think we've talked about blind Bartimaeus when I was with you before. And when he asks Bartimaeus, what can I do for you? And it seems most ridiculously obvious question. But what Jesus needs from disciples, from Mary, from Bartimaeus, from so many other people, and from us, is for us to express our need of him. And then he will most wonderfully answer. So, let's move on. Back to the boat. John has the spiritual insight, and Peter, the man of action, responds immediately. See how God uses somebody of insight and somebody of action, and they work together really well. And Peter gets himself decent. He gets some kind of clothing on, and jumps into the water and just lunges as fast as he can towards Jesus. And I'm no doubt that as he's doing this and the pieces are falling into place for him and he's making the connections, it's the most wonderful few yards of rushing through the water back to the side of Jesus. And Jesus has shown himself, he's shown his power is as intact as it ever was through this miracle. But he's showing them more than power here. And choosing to reveal himself in this way and to bring them through this little journey of failure and a miracle, and now to actually call them to the shore to be with him. He's actually showing them and beginning to show them something even more important, that his promises are intact. You know, he promised Peter, if you turn to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, that Peter would be the rock on which the church, his church, Jesus' church, would be built. And it's an amazing encouragement, this, because these men have lost heart, haven't they? Peter, particularly, he's lost heart. They've given up and they've tried to take back their lives and some control of their lives by going back to the familiar, going back to fish, what they know best. But Jesus, lovingly, not judgmentally, but lovingly, is reappearing to them, meeting them at the point of their need, challenging them about their need and their need of him, and then performing the miracle in response to that need. So we've got a familiar failure, verses 1 to 3, a familiar miracle in verses 4 to 8. Let's bring it together now by looking at verses 9 to 14. Now, I have another clever picture for you. You may or may not recognise this. I'm going to try and get it a bit closer for you there. This is the Tavern Company on Smithdown Road. Now, I don't know whether you're as familiar with this. Us down in the south end of the city, it's a very familiar place for us. And I can tell you that for quite a number of our people, as soon as the cafes and the restaurants maybe start to reopen again, the Tavern Company is going to be one of the first places they head to. Why? Because it's absolutely famous for its breakfasts. Legendary. You're queuing out the door on a Saturday morning to get a breakfast at the Tavern Company. Well, Jesus knew a few things about food, and here in verse 9 they get to the shore, they get onto land, and Jesus has started to prepare a breakfast. And meals been quite an important thing for Jesus throughout his ministry. I mean, he's met and ate with tax collectors, with his disciples. You can read that in Matthew. He's met with Pharisees. Throughout Luke, you can read accounts of him meeting with Pharisees and sharing food with them. And with Martha and Mary, also in Luke. So Jesus knows a thing or two about food. And of course, his most famous miracles, his first miracle, recorded miracle, was was changing water into wine at a wedding feast. And then perhaps one of his most spectacular miracles in terms of numbers was feeding over 5,000 people. And so we come to this modest meal now that Jesus has started to prepare. He's put some fish on the fire already, but when they approach him, he tells them to return to the boat and to bring some of the fish that they, or rather he, has found for them. Why does he want them to go back to the boat, bring the nets to shore, and get some of the fish that he has caught? Well, I'd like to suggest again, if I may, that Jesus here wants them not just to marvel at the quantity of fish. Remember, they couldn't even get the nets in the boat. They were that heavy, they were that full. But he wants them to see and appreciate the quality of the catch. And John briefly describes how many of them there are, 153. This is in verse 11. And he refers to them as large fish. The nets are full. There is no room for any more fish in the nets. And the fish are good. The fish are large. The fish are strong. But notice something else that John tells you there in verse 11. The net, despite being bulging full with large fish, is not torn. Not one fish has been lost out of this net. Can you keep that in mind? When Jesus first performed this miracle back in Luke chapter 5, what did Jesus say to Peter, who was astonished at the time? And he fell down on his knees, Peter, and he just declared how unworthy he was to Jesus. And Jesus said this to Peter in Luke 5. He said this, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." And what's happening now in John chapter 21 is that Jesus has taken Peter and the other disciples back to that original promise. And Peter, of course, has failed Jesus. He's denied him, and he's let Jesus down. But what is happening here is that Jesus is starting to restore Peter. He's bringing him back to the shore. He's bringing him back to the original promise that he made to Peter. And as you read on in John chapter 21, you will read about how Jesus restores Peter and how he tells him what he is going to do next. But for now, Jesus is, before that moment, he's bringing Peter back to himself, and he's doing it through reminding him and showing him again of the promise that he will catch men. He will be a fisher of men. And Jesus is the ultimate fisherman, fishing for souls, pardon the pun, human souls, human hearts. So from a familiar failure and a familiar miracle, we're beginning to see the relationship, particularly for Peter and for the disciples, being restored. He is alive. They belong to him. He wants them with him. They're going to enjoy a family meal on the shore, a social occasion, a time to catch up, a time just to be together, enjoy each other's company, and a sense of belonging. And that's it. That's where this living parable ends there in verse 14. John just wants to point out to you that this was the third time that Jesus revealed himself to the disciples, and what an amazing way in which he's done it. You know, I'm very conscious that these 7 men had been through 3 years of being very close to the Lord, living with him. And they've been close to him physically and spiritually. Couldn't have been closer, really. And then it was taken away. And Jesus has died. Yes, he's risen again, but they are feeling alone, and they're feeling detached and vulnerable and disconnected. And you know, when I speak to people at the moment in church, and we phone each other up and we maybe text each other, that word disconnection keeps coming through time and time again. And it's perhaps feeling more and more disconnected with every passing week. And we're vulnerable, aren't we? We're separated from each other. We're separated from the day-to-day and the momentum and the busyness and the activity and the excitement and the fun and the hassles and the normality that is church and the church family. And it's changed, and we are now separated. And it's very, very easy to feel disconnected. I feel disconnected. I don't know about you. And I see the bit of a parallel here with these men as they're sitting there on the shore in verse 1. What next? What's the future? And where's Jesus now? And what's he doing? And what's it all about? And what's happening? Well, one thing that I hope you will take from today, and from not from me, but from the verses here, is that just as he was waiting on the shore here in John chapter 21, Jesus is waiting on the shore now. And what's he waiting to do? To reconnect with us at our point of need. It'd be very easy to judge ourselves and to say, well, I've grown away from the Lord over the last few weeks. I feel I've disconnected myself. Maybe so. Maybe that's true. But notice how Jesus deals with these men. He doesn't come to judge them. He's not on the shore shaking the fist. He's on the shore waiting to meet them, to reconnect, to meet them at the point of their failure and disconnection, and to reconnect with them And in the most amazing way, because he reconnects with them and he reminds them of who he is, what he is doing. It's a parable, and they're part of it. He's waiting on the shore, waiting in love. You know, Jesus' plans are on track, and coronavirus and anything else, and principalities and powers, as the Bible describes, in other words, anything and everything that the world can throw at Jesus will not affect his plans and his promises. They are secure. He will carry out his purposes, his salvation purposes. And if you're feeling disconnected this morning, maybe you need to connect with Jesus for the first time, or maybe you have connected with him and perhaps because of the last few weeks and what's happening at the moment, or maybe for other reasons you are disconnected. Can you be encouraged, please, from this chapter that Jesus will take the initiative. He's there waiting to reconnect, to bring you back to his side, to bring you back to the shore. And what he wants to do is just for you to spend some time with him, get to know him afresh. And there's many ways we can do that, and we do that through his word. And it also occurs to me, and it's something, again, we've found so important over the last few weeks, is just through having conversations with each other, however we can do it, through the phone or Zoom or WhatsApp, just to ponder and just to talk about the Lord, just to chat about him, you know, maybe over a virtual breakfast with some friends, and just try and reconnect and just discuss him, ponder Jesus anew and what he's doing. That can be a really good way to remind ourselves that he is actually still who he is, doing what he's doing. So there were some words I'd like you just to hold on to today. It will be the words of John himself there, the words that he says to Peter there back in verse 7. It is the Lord. I hope that's been helpful to you today. Please reread those verses and just follow the story again for yourself, and just see how Jesus so wonderfully brought these men who were disconnected back to himself and takes them forward now into his promises and his plans through this most amazing living parable. God bless. Stay safe and keep well. And please keep trusting in Jesus. He has never changed, and his plans are on track. Thank you for listening.